Some of you might remember me. I'm the traveling photographer who chases photos in strange locales. My story about the ghost grass hermit got the attention of a magazine that was interested in strange locales. It's not as much traveling as I'm used to, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't nice to sleep in a bed more than on the ground. I've spent the night in haunted hotels in Louisiana, shrieking forests in the Midwest, and looking for strange creatures in the various backwoods of the American South. So when I got the message about checking out a forest in Maine, I was a little hesitant. This time of year, the weather is likely to be frigid, and blundering into haunted woods in the middle of winter is no one's idea of a good time. The check the magazine was talking about writing me, however, was definitely a game changer. So I packed my stuff and headed out. I had time to read up on it while I flew from Tampa, skunk ape sighting had turned out to be a homeless guy, to Maine, the home of the king of horror, and some pretty picturesque scenery. The locals claim that the woods were home to some malevolent spirit, it seemed. A spirit who made toys. Local legend said that the people have been finding wooden toys in the woods for years, the first being reported in 1860. After 1850 or so, there was supposed to be an old man who lived in the woods out there. An old man who sometimes came into town to sell homemade goods. He had the usual fare, bowls and animals and things, but his puppets were supposed to draw buyers from far and wide. He made enough from his hand-carved goods to live comfortably away from society, and most people just believed he was a harmless old man. One winter, however, a group of kids went missing. The town turned out to try to find them, but as the snow came down and the hour grew late, hope seemed to dwindle that they'd ever be found. They asked the old man if he'd seen the missing kids, and he shook his head and told them he would keep an eye out for them. As the snow piled up and the winter wind whipped, the people in town began to wonder if he had maybe seen the kids and just wasn't saying. Someone said a few of the boys had been seen talking to him not long ago, admiring his puppets and hanging around his stand. They began to get a little stir-crazy, thinking about the boys and picturing all kinds of unnatural things he could be doing out there. So in the dead of winter, they had gone out and broken down the old man's door, handing out a savage beating and searching every nook and cranny for the missing kids. Except they never found any kids, and the beating they handed down had been a little too zealous. The old man was dead, and when the snows melted, the town found the kids in a snowdrift under a makeshift lean-to that they had used to get out of the snow. The townspeople sure were sorry about what they had done, but when they went to dig the old man up so they could bury him in the churchyard, his body was gone. They said they had glimpsed smoke coming up the chimney as well when they approached, and candles that suddenly went out when they knocked on the door. After that, the puppets had started appearing in the woods. Some people admitted to having hung them in memory of the old man and the terrible thing they had done to him, but some of them couldn't be accounted for by the mourners. People went missing every now and again too, and some of the puppets began to look like the missing people. The forest had since been integrated into the state park, and the Toymakers cabin was one of the park's landmarks. It had been well maintained, as had the surrounding woods, and lots of people came to see the Toymakers woods. When my plane landed in Portland around 3.5 hours later, I was raring to have a look at the place. It was another 3 hours in a rental car from there, heading up into the heart of Maine as I followed the signs to a little town on the edge of the Maslow State Park called Bucklowder. They were pegged as one of those rustic tourist towns, kind of like Williamsburg but with less PR. They had done okay, I suppose, and it was likely thanks in part to the people who came to write stories about them. I rolled in right around nightfall and found people in long skirts and buckle hats closing up shop for the night. The tourists had either gone somewhere else or had turned in for the night, and now the blacksmiths and the hunters and tanners could go home and watch TV and eat dinner and get some sleep so they could do it again tomorrow. The Hog's Mouth Inn was my destination, and I was glad to see it as I drove into the parking lot behind the building. The snow flurries had been coming down for the last 2 hours, and I was very glad I had thought to pack winter clothes when I left Florida, which had been a balmy 72 degrees when I got on the plane. The temperature gauge on my car said it was about 32 now, and the tourists were going to be in for a real winter scene tomorrow, I had no doubt. After checking in, I decided to come downstairs and have a look at their after-hours show. The bar area was a series of long tables where guests and actors ate by candlelight and paid a pretty penny for the ambience. The place had a pretty steep price tag for somewhere I was expected to sleep on a mattress I'd expect to see at a Howard Johnson and eat vegetable stew with a bunch of guys in rough-spun clothes. But the magazine was footing the bill for expenses, and I decided there would likely be no better place for getting local legends than right here in town. So I sat at the bar, ate some lukewarm stew, drank a watered-down beer, and asked the woman in the apron if she knew anything about the legend of the Toymakers woods. Her eyes went wide, but it was clearly not the first time that she had been asked. "I wouldn't go out there if I was you. It's a haunted place, and it has a dark aura about it." "So I've heard," I said, setting down the glass and asking for another. "So does the old Toymaker still leave the puppets in the trees?" She didn't seem to like the question, but it was probably the accompanying smirk that set her off. That smirk tried to tell her that we both knew better. I was still pretty sure this was something the locals were doing to promote tourism at this point. An idea I wouldn't be divested of for a while yet. "He does, as I think you know. You think yourself witty by making fun of our local legends, but there are still some things in this world that can't be explained away so easily. You'd think that someone like yourself, someone who'd seen the unexplainable and lived to tell, would be a little more open-minded." I was speechless. Had she read my article? "How do you know It's plain to those who've lived in the shadow of strange and terrible things all their lives. Let's hope you'll come out of the woods as easily as you came out of whatever it was you ran afoul of before." I finished my second drink in silence, the barmaid moving to the other end of the polished wooden edifice and shooting dark looks at me until I left my money and took my leave. I woke up the next morning to find a winter wonderland outside and had to make a trip to the local outfitters before setting out. One pair of hiking boots, some snow pants, and several other warm bits of cover later, and I was off. The outfitter had also sold me a map of the area, which showed the start of the trailhead not too far from the edge of town. It took a little longer than I would have liked to find it in the snow, but I eventually oriented myself and found the Toymakers trailhead. The snow had turned the woods into a German fairy tale, and as I made my way down the snowy path, I couldn't help but feel a little like some peasant kid trying to find his way home. With all that colorless terrain surrounding me, it almost felt like I was back in the ghost grass again. The sign at the start of the path told me that it was about 3 miles to the Toymakers' cabin. Not a very strenuous walk in the summer or the spring, but in the snow, it would feel more like 5 or 6. The powder wasn't waist deep, of course, but I was keenly aware of the crunch, crunch, crunch of my new snow boots as I made my way towards the cabin. I had my camera out and decided to take a few pictures of the expansive winter landscape as I went. I saw signs of deer in the snow, some frozen pellets, probably left by a rabbit, and when I went to take a picture of some long plants jutting from a frozen icy pond, I saw the first of the puppets. I've been saying puppets, but I suppose what they were was marionettes. I inspected a few of them and found nowhere to put a hand to make the mouth move. They were sitting in trees, hanging from branches by their strings, some of them lying on the ground in a heap, but all of them looked meticulously crafted and expertly carved. They were dressed in all manner of outfits, but a lot of them looked like they might be wearing jogging pants or hiking clothes. Some of them were definitely children, and seeing them hanging merrily from the trees made me remember the story that I had read about this place. Walking through all this snow made me wonder if this was what the kids had experienced as they trudged through that same snow, cold and hungry, just trying to get home again. The farther I went, the more it seemed like I too could easily get lost out here. I was a tourist, but I could imagine that even the locals would be hard-pressed to find their way out of here. All this white, all this ice would cover up landmarks and make it that much easier to get turned around. You could blunder around out here for hours just trying to find the right trail, only to realize that you'd gone deeper into the woods instead of closer to town. The woods were made up of birches and spruces, hardy old pines, and the snow bothered them not at all. They hung close together, bearing the weight of all that powder stoically, and amongst the limbs were the puppets that I had come to see. Always those infernal puppets. When it began to get dark, I realized that I'd been wandering this trail for hours. It had been early morning when I left, 8 or 9 at the latest, and as I watched the sun begin to dip a little, I started getting worried that I was lost. The map I had did very little to help. The area was unknown to me, and the landmarks that would have meant something to the locals were just so much snow-covered nothing. I still hadn't come to the Toymakers' cabin, and with every step I was less sure that I would ever find it. It was 3:30 by my watch when I noticed the smoke curling up on the horizon, and I headed towards it like a dying man towards rescue. I had hoped it was someone's chimney in town, but the closeness of the trees made me think it might be the cabin that I'd been looking for. The thought that somebody had hiked out here at first light to pretend to be some creepy toymaker made me want to applaud his resilience, but I was hoping that he had a snowmobile or something to get back to town. Hell, I would settle for a guide to find my way back to the trailhead at this point. Whoever was up here likely knew the way out at any rate, and I was cold and soaked enough to want to get back somewhere warm. My hands shook a little as I came up to the cabin, my camera coming up as I clicked a few pictures of the dark wood dwelling. It was a single-room cabin, nothing fancy by today's standards, but it was long and likely contained a loft above the floor. I could just imagine the workshop that must exist inside there, the tables and benches that held the creations, the wonders that he would create there, and suddenly I wanted to see it. I went right on wanting a peek until my knock was answered by something from a nightmare. The door opened with a long and ominous creak, and inside was less than inviting. The shadows weren't particularly long outside, but the inside of the workshop was pitch black. The face that leered out had an unsettlingly toothy grin to go along with its cold red eyes. Its body was undeterminable, the dark hiding it like a cloak, but its face loomed down at me like a jack-o'-lantern from a high shelf. He grinned at me from a space near the top of the door, and I felt my lower lip tremble a little as his eyes fell on me. "Well, hello, traveler. You look cold. Would you like to come inside and sit by the fire?" Its voice sounded like an echo from the pits of hell, but that wasn't what had decided me on backing away from the invitation. When the door had opened, a smell like wet copper had nearly bowled me over. It was a smell like blood, and I knew that if I went into that house, I would never come out again. No, thank you," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I was just wondering which way would get me back to town." "That way," it said, and I assumed it must have pointed. "I'd walk with you, but I can't abide the light. It hurts my eyes, you see. If you'd like to wait until the sun sets, however, I'd be happy to walk you back to town." I shook my head. "No, thank you. My friends are waiting for me, and I must be going." Of course. Hurry along now. As it closed the door, the portal creaked on swollen hinges, but not loud enough for me to hear it whisper, "Wouldn't want you to be caught out after dark, now would we?" I ran as fast as I could, using the puppets as a guidepost. Suddenly, their height in the tree made sense. This thing had been crouching to talk to me, and I bet its arms would have no trouble placing those puppets in the boughs of the nearby firs. They seemed to taunt me as I ran, enticing me to hurry. The sun might keep it inside for now, they seemed to say through their painted smiles, but what will happen when it goes down? I haven't been so afraid since I lay on the floor of the hermit's shack, listening as I wondered if he would kill me. I ran as the sun set, and fate must have been with me that day. The journey that had taken me all day seemed to end in a few minutes, and I could soon see the town in profile as the sun set behind it. I raced the shadows into town, expecting to hear a howl or a scream as the darkness allowed him to leave his den, and as I closed the door of the inn behind me, I saw the patrons at the bar looking up questioningly. The barmaid, however, seemed to know exactly what had happened. As I came to rest at the bar, snow falling off my clothes, she set a mug of something hot down in front of me. Her look was knowing, like she had guessed what had happened, but it also looked sympathetic, like she understood what I had been through. It was pretty clear that she too had been to the cabin and possibly even seen something that haunted her to this day. "Don't worry, it doesn't come into town. Never has, not since our great-great-great-grandsires kicked in its door and murdered it for a crime it had no part of. It's called the Toymakers' Woods for a reason, and that's where it hunts its prey." I nodded, taking a sip of the mead she put down in front of me. It was warm and thick and good. "How many have gone missing in those woods?" I asked. Not really sure I wanted the answer. "Not so many as you might think. Enough that the Forestry Service goes out with dogs a few times a month, but never after dark. It prefers to take locals if it can. It remembers that the townspeople are responsible for its suffering, and it means to exact revenge a drop at a time. To its credit, it probably kills as few tourists as it can. Tourists are usually noticed when they go missing. The locals know to stay out of the woods or to accept the dangers of going in." I stayed in Bucklowder for a few days, the snowdrifts making me afraid to take my rental car back on the road. By the time the snows began to recede some, I had a great article full of Bucklowder's history and lore. My editor loved it, my readers loved it, and it definitely made an impression on yours truly. I had a little more respect for local color after that, though it certainly didn't stop my editor from sending me to strange and interesting places. I'm sure you'll hear from me again sometime, but until then, remember to trust that funny feeling you get sometimes when you're out on the trail or hiking in an unfamiliar area. It just might save you from becoming part of a local legend yourself. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Saikat, Lee Kendall, Janet, and Chris Kinsella for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And, of course, thanks to Xaronan, Winter, Tyler Parker, Stephanie Carrington, Sarah ASMR, Hi Stacy, Emily Coltsfoot, and Cinnamon Fox, and Bella Lee for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. As I said, if you'd like to have your name read out at the end of every episode that I make, and maybe get a little more, come on down to Patreon and sign up, or become a member on YouTube. Ghostly Reader tier contributors get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and give it a look. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.